my initial question is what happened to the fiscal crisis. So last year the budget was all about debt and deficit disasters and intergenerational theft, but the FY16 budget is all about spending and growing the Australian economy. So the government's announced $10 billion of extra spending, and it certainly is coming at a time where the economy does need it. The RBA has come out and said that the growth outlook's very soft. They've cut rates down to record lows. So I tend to think that net spending is actually going to be welcomed. Overall, the two key areas of the spending increase are in childcare and a very big package for small business, which I tend to think is going to be quite constructive for the Australian economy during this mining investment unwind. Quite clearly, there are still deficits. There's no forecast return to surplus in the out years. The return to surplus is 5 years away. There's $82 billion worth of deficits. Now that's less than the $152 billion we've had in the last 4 years. So I tend to think things are moving in the right direction. Quite clearly, the government needs confidence to rise in both the consumer and in the corporate space to meet these budget objectives. But overall, I tend to think this budget has got a much higher probability of that occurring than certainly they had last year. So in the end, I'm reasonably optimistic. Well, given the weak starting position and the fact that the Australian economy is a little bit weaker than what the government forecast last year, and commodity prices have undergone a very large decline, the amount of fiscal slippage in this budget is actually quite minor. The $10 billion of extra spending has pretty much been met by $10 billion of extra savings, with the shelving of government programs, including the paid parental leave, which was very expensive to implement. But given the fact that debt is going to be a bit higher in each of the out years, it takes an extra year to get back to surplus. Quite clearly, gross and net debt in Australia is going to rise. Gross debt's forecast to rise to over $500 billion in FY18, and our net debt is going to double in the 6 years to FY19 to $325 billion. So in the scheme of things, these debt figures are rising, and whilst they're not very large as a share of GDP relative to our global peers, I think the government really needs to get a handle on this so the situation doesn't get out of control. Have to remember the Australian economy hasn't had a recession in 25 years, so we are due for one, and that is the time when you actually want the government to be able to increase their spending. But if the budget balance isn't controlled, then they won't necessarily have that policy ammunition. Well, given the fact that the Treasurer is just increasing spending modestly in the out years, and it does take an extra year to get back to surplus, I think quite clearly the government's passing the baton to supporting the Australian economy during the mining investment unwind to the RBA and to the currency. There is a pretty optimistic forecast return to trend growth within 2 years. I tend to think that's a little bit over the top. I think it might take an extra year to get back to those levels. So in essence, I tend to think the deficits might be a little bit larger and the debt build-up may be a bit more than what's currently in the budget estimates. It's not a particularly tight budget, and in that way I think the government's really opted for boredom rather than boldness to address the fiscal imbalances which are clearly in the out years. So in that way, they're not really putting too hard a brake on the Australian economy, certainly when it doesn't need it in the next couple of years. But I tend to think in years 3 and 4, they're going to have to do more work to get the budget onto a much more sustainable footing. Well, in many ways, budgets in recent years have been more about the politics really than about the economics. And as the government found out last year, announcing a budget can be very easy, but actually getting it implemented through the Parliament is a much more arduous task. And in that way, given the fact there are still some controversial spending and tax measures in this budget, I tend to think its path through the Parliament is going to be a bit more difficult than what we saw during the Howard years or even during the Gillard years. So what we have in Canberra at the moment is we have Senate gridlock. There's a Senate which is engaging in a lot of populism without actually going through a detailed conversation about how a lot of the extravagant policy implemented over the past 7 years can actually be funded at a sustained rate without really blowing out the debt levels. So I don't think anyone's expecting the Treasurer to be coming up with a return to surplus within the next 2 years. what we're really wanting is to see the gap between spending growth and revenue growth start to narrow. And that is actually what we are starting to see. But it's probably not occurring at a fast enough rate. So until someone in Canberra is willing to have that national debate about how we can get the budget back into a sustained footing, our national debt is going to continue to grow. But of course, with government interest rates at 3%, the key question is anyone really going to notice?